Will Pomeranz is Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. He joins us to discuss the latest on U.S.-Russia relations. And boy, Will, that's a moving target. That changes almost by the minute. This is quite the story you've been following.
It is indeed. What was expected to be just a one-day summit, a 2-hour meeting, has now morphed into a 4-day and counting spectacle.
Yeah, and part of the spectacle has been really, President Trump has been taking a beating from not just his usual critics on the other side of the aisle or in the press, but also from people in the Republican Party and almost people around the world. What about President Putin? What has been the reaction to his performance?
Well, not surprisingly, since the Russian state controls the central media,
that helps.
The reaction has been positive. And in many ways, that's a correct perception. Putin stood next to President Trump as an equal, which is what he wanted to have occur. He controlled the agenda. If you recall, when they asked the two participants what occurred in the room, President Putin had a rather long answer and touched on various different subjects.
Specific subjects.
Specific subjects. Syria, Ukraine, cybersecurity, nuclear weapons. I mean, he clearly had at least notes as to what he discussed in the meeting. President Trump simply issued kind of familiar statements about the investigation and about his desire to have better relations with the Russian Federation, but didn't really provide any detail.
Let's rewind the tape then. Why did the summit occur in the first place? Who initiated?
President Trump initiated the summit, and if you ask the Russians in the lead up to the summit, they all said it would never take place. And they said it would never take place because you needed time to prepare. You needed time to go over what was going to be discussed, what sort of statements would be made, what sort of agreements might be achieved, etc., etc. They wanted a planned meeting. President Trump is a man in a hurry. He did not want to have the slow diplomatic wheels in progress. He wanted to have a big splashy event. And that's why he was the driving force to have the event in Helsinki when it occurred.
I heard one analysis that said this was almost a culmination of all of President Putin's time in office, that what came together for him this week with the combination of the rough going at the NATO summit for the allies and then the dominance of Putin's performance at the press conference.
Right. It kind of summarized President Trump's foreign policy. It's fast, it's improvised, and he doesn't necessarily have the follow-through necessary to implement whatever is agreed upon. I think we already saw that in Singapore when we're actually not sure what was agreed upon and what denuclearization means to North Korea as opposed to the United States. And we're seeing the same thing occur in Helsinki. It was only President Putin who talked about commissions on cybersecurity or a commission for business leaders, etc., etc. One did not hear any sort of concrete steps from President Trump as to what happens next.
So you talked about the fact that summits usually take a lot of preparation, and that's why the Russians thought this may never happen. And then usually there's massive follow-up because something happens. This is almost sounding Seinfeldian here, the summit about nothing. Is there an outcome?
Well, I think there's an outcome, but it's not what we anticipated would be the outcome. I think in light of President Trump's statements, I think in light of the fact that he's had such a difficult time articulating what he believed in and denying certain actions that one expected him to deny, most notably the interference by Russians in the U.S. elections, that the outcome could only be doubt about what the United States stands for. And that is both a result of Helsinki, but is also a result of the meeting that occurred in Brussels and the NATO summit, where he was much more confrontational with our allies than he was with President Putin.
President Trump keeps suggesting that, well, good things will eventually come out of this, hinting at whatever it is that the two leaders talked about in private. Do you think it's conceivable, given the politics within the U.S. and all of the dark clouds that surround U.S.-Russian relations, specifically the campaign information wars, that there can be any concrete follow-up from this summit?
Well, I think there can be commissions. I think there can be dialogue. I think there can be attempts to address the nuclear weapons issue. I think that would be a positive follow-on from this meeting. But the politics of the whole situation for President Trump is very difficult. Most notably, one of the crucial obstacles to improving U.S.-Russian relations are the sanctions that were put in place in the aftermath of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine by Russians. And those sanctions have now been legislated. President Trump can't get rid of them. And it's one of the things that President Putin wants to have removed. in order to increase U.S. and Russian trade. And so since he doesn't have any leeway on sanctions, since all his statements in the aftermath of the summit have only complicated things for President Trump, as opposed to make them simpler, it is very hard to see what sort of deep changes take place in the U.S.-Russian relationship in the aftermath of this summit.
Will anything tangible be realized for Putin and Russia from this? Is there anything that they can use moving forward in any of their strategic interests?
Well, they can use the fact that Russia is perceived as a major power again.
Perceptions.
Yeah, so the perception is here's Russia in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis and the Syria crisis, ostracized from the international community. Not completely, and obviously Russia has allies and friends that it can work with. But this meeting that President Trump was so insistent upon having portrayed Russia as an equal, and Putin portrayed it as an attempt for the United States and Russia to sit down together and to solve the world's problems.
But does that open hand from President Trump extend to any other nations?
Not as generously so far as it has occurred for President Trump.
I mean the benefit for Russia. I mean, I'm sorry, I said the question wrong, and you answered the question I asked. What I was really asking is there a residual benefit for Russia in its dealing with other nations because the U.S. has sort of qualified Russia as an equal player or a semi-equal player at the table?
It can have positive ramifications. Again, one of the things that holds back investment in Russia is the fear that the United States is going to put new sanctions and get in the way of foreign investment in Russia. One would potentially walk away from this meeting thinking that President Trump is not interested in levying new sanctions on Russia.
But many members in Congress say they are.
Exactly. So that is the seed of doubt. So, but if indeed, there are no new sanctions, if this is the high watermark in sanctions, Russia can find a way around the ones that exist.
Will help us understand Mr. Putin on the level that you hear that he is this skilled KGB trained interrogator who really knows how to play it from body language to every utterance that comes from his mouth. Others say, hey, look, he may be tactically strong within the moment, but long-term strategy he's lacking, and that Russia is still playing a weak hand in the big picture. What's true?
Russia is playing a weak hand, but it's playing it very, very well. And Russia is, the perception was, Russia and the United States equal players. They're not equal players. The United States is significantly stronger militarily and is significantly stronger economically. And Putin faces all sorts of economic difficulties in terms of promoting growth, in terms of having a diversified economy, in terms of dealing with questions of corruption. These are all things that are significant drains on the Russian economy. And yet there he was in Helsinki standing next to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump saying, we should have better relations so that we can solve the world's problems together. There is nothing Russians like to hear better, that they have a direct seat at the table to solve global problems.
Is there a risk for Mr. Putin that he is overplaying his weak hand, in that this sort of elevation in the world of perceptions might create great expectations for outcomes, concrete outcomes, improvements in the Russian economy being one example of that? Is it a possibility that he's creating expectations that he can't meet?
I don't think so, no. I don't think the Russian people have great expectations as to how their economy is going to improve and how fast it's going to improve. Indeed, they're just...
So just the prestige boost alone is good enough?
Absolutely. I mean, Russia is coming out of a deep 2-year recession with really a very weak recovery. I don't think Russians are anticipating that their economy is going to be competitive to the United States, China, or Europe for that matter. What they want to see is Russia to play its rightful role as a major power on the world stage. And that's what occurred in Helsinki.
So the big win that most people are saying you agree with, this is a big win for Russia, at least in the world of perceptions.
In the world of perceptions, and if Trump follows through on his policies, if indeed there is a wedge now between the United States and the EU, and if the EU further divides over the question of Nord Stream 2, this pipeline that the Russians want to build to Germany, then it is also playing to Putin's hand, because Putin doesn't want to deal with the EU as a whole. He wants to deal bilaterally with each nation, Russia, Germany, Russia, France. There he can interact more on an equal level. But if he has to interact between Russia and the EU, then he's playing a weaker hand. So there is something, there are potential positive gains that Putin receives out of this summit and out of these trends.
The sort of the fly in the ointment here, though, is this what has been called Russian meddling, which almost sounds trivial. So I think I prefer something like or disinformation wars or cyber wars or something like that. What happens there? Because Putin has been consistently, his message has been consistent that deny, deny, deny. U.S. intelligence has no doubt. How does Russia move forward in its global relationships, in its standing in the world, if it continues to be a thorn in the side of the West from this sort of activity in the realm of information wars?
Well, one, it depends on how well the West responds to this disinformation, whether it has the ability to inform its citizens about what are facts and how the Russians are using information to deceive others.
So you're saying they can get away with it as long as not enough people believe it's actually happening?
They can get away with it if indeed it's playing into people's beliefs. I mean, I think the argument is somehow Russia influenced the election. And if it did so, it only did so on the margins because there are plenty of people who believed what was already being put in front of them. So it's not as if the Russians duped them. It was kind of the general level of debate in the United States that the Russians simply played into. So in that sense, they used disinformation and they could potentially influence people on the margins. But obviously, in light of President Trump's victory, there were plenty of people who believed in President Trump with or without the Russian information.
Let's put that aside, the politics. Let's say that they didn't influence the vote and it's a clean victory, electoral victory for the president. But what about those other things that they are diving into, where Dan Coates has warned against sort of, he's even invoked 9/11 and talked about the U.S. power grid or some of the other vulnerabilities that exists in a technologically based system.
If the Russians go after that, then the United States would have to have a more coordinated and direct response to those actions. And we would then be in really uncharted waters because it's unclear how deterrence works in the area of cybersecurity. That we can raise the level and we can respond to it. But the question then becomes, if we respond, do the Russians in fact have a larger response that is in fact more devastating than potentially than the one they had introduced to start such a problem?
Is Russia willing to stop? Is there a deal to be made where Russia would stop these sort of subversive activities?
I don't think there's a deal to be made in terms of kind of getting information out there. I think there are deals to be made about how one uses cybersecurity and how countries potentially weaponize cybersecurity and how countries can agree not to let that happen. That is a new area of law. That is a new area of negotiation. The United States has not been an active participant in those negotiations. The Russians have raised that issue in various international forums. So that's something that has to be discussed going forward. But there is no reason to suspect that Russia will not continue to do so. And it's very interesting to see Putin's response. He's emphasized that it's not the Russian state that is involved in these activities. It's simply Russian companies or people who he's not familiar with.
That he doesn't control.
That he doesn't control. Now, one can be very suspicious of such deniability, but that's a crucial part of Vladimir Putin's strategy as well. And that's why the indictment, Mueller's indictment, was so devastating, was instead of going after a private company that Putin can theoretically deny knowledge of, he went after military intelligence officers.
Well, I have no doubt we'll be speaking again because we're probably not even at the halfway point of this story. There's much more to come.
No, and I fear President Trump today was suggesting another summit. So
wow.
This could be an ongoing discussion.
And you talk about all this new area of law opening up. Will is a lawyer, so maybe you'll be back in practice.
It'll take a lot to convince me to go back to practice.
Thanks for joining us today, Will.
My pleasure.